Berlin,
December 11th, 1941. The atmosphere inside the Kroll Opera House is electric. Adolf Hitler stands at the podium, his voice rising in a crescendo of fury. For days earlier, the Japanese Empire had attacked Pearl Harbor. Now, the German Führer is about to make the most catastrophic decision of his life. He declares war on the United States of America. To the modern observer, this seems like madness. Why would Germany, already locked in a brutal death struggle with the Soviet Union and the British Empire, voluntarily invite the world's largest industrial power into the conflict? The answer lies in a dangerous mixture of arrogance, racial ideology, and a fundamental misunderstanding of what modern war actually was. To Hitler and the German High Command, America was a joke. It was a paper tiger, something that looked large on a map but was hollow on the inside. In the halls of Berlin, the Nazi elite mocked American culture. They saw the United States not as a nation, but as a disjointed business corporation. They believed Americans were a mongrel race, diluted by immigration, softened by luxury, and corrupted by jazz music and Hollywood. In their worldview, a nation obsessed with buying refrigerators and dancing the jitterbug could never stand against the iron discipline of the Prussian soldier. The Americans, Hitler famously sneered to his foreign minister, are a decayed country. They have their social problems, and they will never be a factor in this war. They are a soap bubble. And if you looked at the facts on the ground in 1939, Hitler seemed to be right. When the war began in Europe, the United States Army was pathetic. In terms of size, it ranked 19th in the world, smaller than the Army of Portugal, smaller than the Army of Romania. While the German Wehrmacht was perfecting the blitzkrieg with panzer divisions and Stuka dive bombers, American soldiers were training in the swamps of Louisiana wearing World War I surplus helmets and carrying bolt-action rifles from 1903. The situation was so desperate that during the Great Louisiana Maneuvers of 1941, the U.S. Army didn't even have enough weapons to train with. Soldiers ran through the mud carrying wooden sticks with the word "gun" painted on them. They drove delivery trucks with the word "tank" scrawled on the side in chalk. They used stovepipes to simulate mortars. German intelligence officers watched these reports and laughed. They reported back to Berlin that the American soldier was undisciplined, their equipment was laughable, and their leadership was inexperienced. General Alfred Jodl, one of Hitler's top commanders, dismissed the U.S. military potential entirely. "We have nothing to fear from them," he said. "It will take them years to build an army, and even then, they cannot swim across the Atlantic." The Germans made a fatal calculation. They judged America by what it was, a sleeping, isolationist nation with a tiny military, rather than what it could become. They ignored the one statistic that mattered. In 1941, the United States possessed more industrial potential than Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. It had half the world's steel. It had infinite oil. It had a population of 130 million people who, beneath their casual exterior, were capable of ruthless engineering efficiency. Hitler believed that war was won by will and blood. He didn't understand that modern global war was won by logistics, assembly lines, and coal. On that cold December day in 1941, when the applause in the Kroll Opera House died down, the clock began ticking. The Germans thought they had declared war on a weak collection of shopkeepers. In reality, they had just kicked open the door to a blast furnace. The paper tiger was about to burn Berlin to the ground. February 10, 1942. A gray Ford sedan rolls off the assembly line near Detroit. It is driven away, the lights flick off, and the machinery grinds to a halt. A strange silence descends over the factory floor. That gray sedan was the last civilian car the United States would produce for 4 years. The government had issued a total ban on the production of private automobiles. The Big Three, Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, were handed a new mandate. They were told to stop making sedans and start making the machinery of death. Berlin watched this with skepticism. Hermann Göring, the head of the German Luftwaffe, scoffed at the idea. He famously declared that Americans were good at making refrigerators and razor blades, but they could never build high-performance aircraft. He believed that building a bomber required the touch of a craftsman, not the brute force of an assembly line. He was wrong. He didn't understand Detroit. The transformation was violent and absolute. In a matter of weeks, the auto plants were gutted. Conveyor belts that once carried engine blocks were ripped out and replaced with overhead cranes capable of carrying tank turrets. The crown jewel of this industrial crusade was a place called Willow Run. The U.S. government asked Ford to build the B-24 Liberator, a massive four-engine heavy bomber. It was one of the most complex machines ever designed, consisting of nearly 500,000 distinct parts. Aviation experts told Henry Ford that it was impossible to mass-produce. In the traditional aircraft industry, a bomber was built like a house. It sat in one spot, and teams of skilled mechanics moved around it, slowly fitting parts by hand. It took a German factory nearly a month to finish one heavy bomber. Ford's production chief, Charles "Cast Iron Charlie" Sorensen, ignored the experts. He sketched a new plan on a hotel napkin. He wouldn't build the plane like a house, he would build it like a Model T. He built a factory that was a mile long. It was the largest room in the history of the world. And inside, he created a river of aluminum. The result was something the world had never seen. By 1944, the Willow Run plant wasn't finishing a plane once a month. It wasn't finishing one a day. At peak production, a fully functional, combat-ready B-24 Liberator was rolling out of the factory doors every 63 minutes. It was an avalanche of aluminum. Meanwhile, at General Motors and Chrysler, the story was the same. Chrysler took their experience making train cars and began churning out Sherman tanks. This highlighted the fundamental difference between the American and German philosophies of war. The German Tiger tank was a masterpiece of engineering. It had hand-welded seams, precision optics, and a complex transmission. It was a Ferrari, but it was difficult to make and impossible to repair in the mud of Russia. The American Sherman tank was a toaster. It was ugly, it was loose, and the engine was essentially a modified tractor motor. But Detroit could build 10 Shermans for the price of one Tiger. When a German tank broke down, it needed a specialized mechanic and a specific part from a specific factory. When an American tank broke down, the crew could often fix it with a sledgehammer and a wrench, or simply swap parts with another tank. Standardization became a weapon. German intelligence officers received reports of these production numbers and simply refused to believe them. They marked the documents as propaganda. They could not conceive of a nation that could launch a new cargo ship every 4 days or build a bomber every hour. By 1944, the Detroit Front had achieved the impossible. The United States was producing more war material than Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. The German generals had prepared to fight soldiers. They were not prepared to fight an assembly line that never slept, never tired, and never stopped coming. The Axis powers were being buried not just by bravery, but by volume. Spring, 1942. The East Coast of the United States. Vacationers in Florida and New Jersey look out at the horizon and see pillars of black smoke. At night, the sky is lit up by burning oil tankers. The war has come to American shores, and America is losing. This was the second happy time for the German U-boat crews. Admiral Karl Donitz, the mastermind of the German submarine fleet, had sent his wolf packs to the American coast. They found a shooting gallery. The U.S. Navy was unprepared. Merchant ships were sailing with their lights on, silhouetted against the glowing cities behind them. In just 6 months, German submarines sank nearly 400 ships. Millions of tons of supplies, tanks, food, aluminum, and fuel meant for Britain and Russia were sent to the bottom of the Atlantic. The situation was catastrophic. General George Marshall looked at the numbers and realized a terrifying truth. America was losing ships faster than it could build them. The arsenal of democracy was useless if the weapons never left the driveway. Unless the Atlantic could be crossed, England would starve, and D-Day would be impossible. The solution did not come from a naval admiral. It came from a construction tycoon named Henry Kaiser. He was a man who had built dams, not ships. But he looked at the shipbuilding industry and saw the same problem Henry Ford had seen in cars. It was too slow. Kaiser introduced the Liberty ship. To the naval traditionalists, the Liberty ship was an insult. It was slow, topping out at 11 knots. It was ugly. President Roosevelt famously called it a dreadful-looking object. It was defensively weak. But it had one quality that mattered more than anything else. It was simple. Before the war, building a cargo ship took about 240 days. Millions of rivets had to be hammered by hand. Kaiser replaced riveting with welding. He prefabricated huge sections of the ship on land, entire cabins, bows, and sterns, and then lifted them into place with cranes, welding them together like a giant Lego set. The speed of production became a psychological weapon. On November 12, 1942, the Kaiser shipyard in Richmond, California, decided to show the world what American industry could do. They laid the keel of the SS Robert E. Peary at shortly after midnight on a Sunday. Teams of welders worked around the clock. By Tuesday, the ship had a shape. By Wednesday, the engines were installed. On Thursday afternoon, 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes after they started, the SS Robert E. Peary was launched into the water, fully painted and ready to sail. It was a publicity stunt, but the message was heard loud and clear in Berlin. The Germans could sink a ship, but they could not sink the factory that built it. By 1943, the tide had turned. The U.S. was launching 3 Liberty ships every single day. The wolf packs were overwhelmed. For every U-boat that hunted, there were simply too many targets, protected by new escort carriers and radar-equipped destroyers. This allowed for Operation Bolero, the greatest migration of military power in history. The Atlantic Ocean ceased to be a barrier. It became a highway, a steel bridge connecting New York to Liverpool. Across this bridge traveled the giants. The RMS Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth, converted into troop transports, would speed across the ocean carrying 15,000 soldiers at a time, an entire army division in a single hull. They were so fast that no U-boat could catch them. By the spring of 1944, the bottom of the Atlantic was littered with German submarines. Above them, an unbroken chain of steel moved east. 1.5 million American soldiers, 5 million tons of equipment, and the fate of Europe arrived safely in England. The Germans had bet that the ocean would protect them. Instead, American industry had paved the ocean. May 1944, southern England. If you were to fly over the British countryside in the weeks leading up to the invasion, you would witness a sight that defied the laws of physics. The lush green fields of Hampshire and Cornwall had vanished. In their place was a sea of olive drab. Every country lane was lined with trucks, bumper to bumper, for miles. Every forest concealed ammunition dumps. Every village green was parked full of Sherman tanks. There was a joke circulating in the pubs of London at the time. The locals would look at the sheer mass of steel and concrete arriving daily from America and say, "It's a good thing we have the barrage balloons floating overhead. If we cut the ropes, the whole island would sink under the weight of the Americans." It was funny, but it felt frighteningly true. Operation Bolero had turned Great Britain into the largest warehouse in human history. The numbers were staggering. By the spring of 1944, there were over 1.5 million American soldiers crammed into the UK. But it wasn't just the men that shocked the Germans. It was what they brought with them. The German Wehrmacht, for all its terrifying reputation, was an army of scarcity. On the Eastern Front, German logistics relied on horses to pull wagons. German soldiers were rationing food, reusing bandages, and scavenging for boots. The Americans, however, did not believe in scarcity. They believed in overwhelming abundance. They brought 13,000 locomotives and freight cars to run on British tracks. They brought 50,000 vehicles. They brought mobile bakeries capable of baking thousands of loaves of fresh bread a day. They brought ice cream machines. They brought millions of packs of Lucky Strike cigarettes, crates of Coca-Cola, and mountains of chewing gum. For the British civilians, who had been living on strict rations for 5 years, the Americans looked like aliens from a planet of infinite wealth. But the most impressive secret of this buildup wasn't the food or the tanks. It was a construction project hiding in the estuaries of the Thames River. Planners like Winston Churchill and Dwight Eisenhower knew a fatal truth. The Germans held all the major ports in France. Cherbourg, Calais, Le Havre, they were turned into fortresses. The Allies couldn't capture them intact. And without a port, you couldn't offload the heavy supplies needed to fight a war. So, the Allies decided to do something the German High Command deemed impossible. If they couldn't capture a port, they would bring their own. These were the Mulberry Harbors. In total secrecy, British and American engineers constructed massive hollow concrete blocks, some as tall as 6-story buildings. They were code-named Phoenixes. To a German reconnaissance pilot flying high overhead, they looked like barges or construction debris. But they were actually the pieces of 2 massive, floating artificial harbors. The plan was audacious. Tow these million-ton concrete monsters across the English Channel, sink them off the beaches of Normandy to create a breakwater, and then deploy miles of floating steel roadways. It was an engineering project rivaling the pyramids, built in secret under the nose of the enemy. While Field Marshal Rommel was busy reinforcing the Atlantic Wall with mines and bunkers, assuming the Allies would have to starve on the beaches without heavy equipment, the Allies were building a portable city that would allow them to drive tanks directly from a ship onto the sand. By the night of June 5th, the buildup was complete. England was a coiled spring. The hedgerows were hiding an army that was better fed, better equipped, and more mechanized than any force in history. The German sentries across the Channel peered into the darkness, expecting a raid. They had no idea that the weak Americans were about to throw the weight of the entire industrial world at their front door. The island wasn't sinking. It was launching. Normandy coast. June 6, 1944. Dawn. Major Werner Pluskat of the German 352nd Infantry Division stands in his bunker overlooking Omaha Beach. He is tired. The weather is terrible, rain, wind, and choppy seas. The German High Command has assured everyone that an invasion is impossible in these conditions. Field Marshal Rommel has even gone home to celebrate his wife's birthday. Pluskat raises his binoculars to scan the gray horizon. He expects to see nothing but empty waves. Instead, he drops his binoculars. His hands are shaking. He wipes the lenses, thinking they are dirty, and looks again. He grabs the phone to his headquarters. "Block!" He screams at the lieutenant on the other end. "The invasion is coming." The lieutenant asks, "Which way are the ships coming from? North? East?" Pluskat screams back a line that would become legendary. "They are not coming from the north or the east. They are coming from everywhere. There is no horizon. It is only ships." What Pluskat was seeing was the physical manifestation of the American industrial miracle. Spread out before him were nearly 7,000 vessels. It was the largest armada ever assembled in the history of mankind. There were battleships with guns the size of tree trunks. There were thousands of landing craft. There were hospital ships, repair ships, and command ships. It was a floating city of steel, stretching as far as the human eye could see. 3 years earlier, Hitler had called America a decayed country that could never cross the Atlantic. Now, the Atlantic was choked with American steel. But the shock wasn't just on the water. It was in the sky. German soldiers looked up, waiting for the mighty Luftwaffe to swoop down and destroy the sitting fleet. They waited, and they waited, but the sky didn't belong to Germany anymore. On D-Day, the Allies flew over 14,000 sorties. The German Luftwaffe managed to fly fewer than 300. General Eisenhower had famously told his son before the invasion, "If you see a plane, don't worry, it's ours." For the German soldier in the trench, This was the moment of ultimate realization. They were not fighting a fair fight. They were fighting an avalanche. One captured German commander, looking at the endless stream of tanks and trucks pouring onto the beach later that day, simply shook his head. He told his captors, "I know how this ends. We have to count every bullet. You don't even count your tanks." The paper tiger had arrived, and it had brought with it a level of logistical power that the German mind, obsessed with tactical brilliance, simply hadn't calculated. Conclusion: when we look back at World War II, we often focus on the bravery of the individual soldiers, the boys on Omaha Beach, the paratroopers in the night. Their courage was undeniable. But the war was not decided solely on the beaches of Normandy in 1944. It was decided in 1942 and 1943 in the factories of Detroit, the shipyards of California, and the steel mills of Pittsburgh. The German mistake, Hitler's fatal blunder, was to judge America by its standing army. He saw a small, unready force and assumed weakness. He failed to see the sleeping giant of industry behind it. He failed to understand that in a modern total war, the nation that can build a bomber every hour, launch a ship every 4 days, and supply an army across an ocean with ice cream and warm socks is a nation that cannot be defeated. On June 6, 1944, the Germans didn't just lose a battle. They were crushed by the weight of a reality they had refused to believe. The weak Americans had built a machine that simply ran them over.